Hello and welcome everybody to this portfolio playbook session on the topic of IT risk. Just as a quick reminder, sorry, I'm just trying to move the slide. Okay, just as a quick reminder, this is the fourth of a mini-series of Alphabet portfolio playbooks. The portfolio playbook series has been on the topic of business outcomes, and each portfolio playbook has been a mixture of slideware with methodology, plus a demonstration using our leading product for enterprise architecture and IT portfolio management, Alphabet. The first three have already been held. They're available as recordings on our YouTube channel. The first one was held on the topic of how to focus IT spending on business priorities. The second one was on the topic of acquisition integration and how we can support that from an enterprise architecture and IT portfolio management perspective. And the third one was on the topic of technology innovation, how we can roadmap that, and how we can identify the innovations that are going to help with business innovation or business optimization. So the topic today is risk. But before going into the topic, just a quick reminder of why we chose this mini-series on the topic of business outcomes. One of the common things that we meet when we're talking to clients or when we're talking to prospective clients, and it's also something we've talked about with Gartner and they also see a lot, is the fact that enterprise architects and IT portfolio practitioners have a problem selling their value to the business. And this obviously results in a different problem that they quite often don't get the budget they need for the different resources and personnel, etc., that they need for their discipline. And when we talk about this with clients, with analysts, etc., two things come up that we can sell. One, we can sell the direct wins, and the direct wins are things like reduction in the cost of maintaining the EA and IT portfolio management data. This data is being managed whether we have a well-organized process and discipline for enterprise architecture and IT portfolio management or not. But if you don't have a well-organized process with tool support, etc., then usually you're doing this in a way which is ad hoc. It's using Microsoft PowerPoint. You have your application portfolio in 1 or 2 or 3 Excel sheets. You're using Visio and different things to document different things. And every now and then a question comes up and you do an ad hoc survey. And these things are expensive in themselves. And introducing a good process-oriented, process-driven practice for EA and IT portfolio management actually reduces the management costs for this data, but it also makes sure that this data is in a better quality and it remains up to date. And that has a second win, and this second win is the fact that the projects, when they're starting, can find information about the IT portfolio and what it does and what it supports and the business relationship to that IT portfolio a lot quicker. They don't have to do research, and that saves project budget, and that can be significant. Some clients we've talked to have said 5 to 10% of project budget. But these sort of direct wins are not so interesting to the business. Yeah, this is for business not necessarily big money. The business is interested in different outcomes, in particular outcomes that help them. So when we talked about the indirect wins, it's the sort of wins we make because we have the enterprise architecture and IT portfolio management data, and we have a discipline in place that can do impact analysis when business comes with a question. When they come with a transformation, we can do planning that's reliable. And those are the things that we have to communicate to the business, say this is the value you're getting. This is where we can help you. This is where we can be your partner. And to do that, part of that is having a good enterprise architecture and IT portfolio management discipline. So that's why we chose the topic. So let's move into the topic, and the topic today is IT risk. And we live, as we know, in a world that's at risk. We've seen many different threats come up in the last couple of years that affect different parts of our lives, just as IT is pervasive in different parts of our lives. So we saw the WannaCry ransomware recently that attacked many different types of organizations, including the National Health System in the UK. We saw that the elections have been affected by data security issues. LinkedIn, social networks are at danger from hackers. Email accounts, 1 billion accounts here from Yahoo were breached, apparently. but also critical things like here a power outage in the Ukraine was done because the systems that manage the power stations and the network were attacked from outside. Here, the Royal Bank of Scotland, a computer failure apparently meant that a particular transfer didn't take place, which meant a guy ended up in prison because his bail didn't come through. Tesco, another a supermarket giant in the UK, also has a bank, and they had suspicious transactions on 40,000 accounts, real money. And the military, they're very afraid that hackers will get through and actually take over or in some way change their systems, leading to catastrophic events. So these are lots of different parts of our lives are affected, and they're really at risk from IT because we've been using IT to be more productive, to be more effective, to actually gain many things over the last decades, but it's also introduced new risk, and we have to be aware of that risk. And awareness is there. This is not new. The regulators and the governments have been busy coming up with standards, coming up with regulations that we have to comply to protect consumers, to protect our financial system, etc. One of the newest here, GDPR, is actually from the European Union, the General Data Protection Regulation, and companies have to be compliant by next May to this regulation. And this is a big thing. It affects not just European companies, but it also affects any company with customers in the EU, which means a good majority of the large American companies and worldwide companies. But also, we've been getting not only regulations, but also support from the standards people such as ISO, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST in the US. They're providing frameworks that help us to tackle the job of IT risk management and definitions, but also more hands-on, such as NIST. They're providing information on vulnerabilities. This is updated month for month on their website, and means that companies, if they see the need, can go here, check vulnerabilities and see which ones are actually critical to them, and we'll be taking a little look at this later in the demonstration. But the real question for today is how can we as enterprise architects and IT portfolio management practitioners support IT risk management efforts? And there are various things that we can do to support IT risk management. One is that because we have this reliable data that we're maintaining, we can provide the IT scope that needs to be assessed when risk management is done. And we can document what IT scope is relevant to which regulation. So we can say, oh, this process and this application is relevant to Sarbanes-Oxley, and this one to data protection law, et cetera, et cetera. And we can provide that data very quickly then. We can also, because we have this data, reduce the assessment costs. Assessment costs are high. If anything we can do to automate an IT risk assessment or control assessments as part of the IT risk management efforts is going to save us money. And because we have the data here, we can use that to automate the process, and we could do this in Alphabet itself, or we could export the data to a GRC solution such as Iris GRC, and it could be done there. We also, because we have the enterprise architecture model, which brings the different parts of the IT scope together, we have the ability to use that model to understand the relationships between a process at the top and a physical device at the bottom of the scope, and then use different rules to abstract and aggregate key risk indicators to tell us things about the risk or potential damage at different levels. And we'll look at this more on a following slide. And last but not least, we can also baseline risk. That means we can do our risk assessments, for example, across our application portfolio, understand which applications need the most protection and most at risk, etc. But we also, because we have approval processes for change to application lifecycles, we can ensure that every time a new application is introduced, or even when one is taken away, that risk assessment is reviewed so that our baseline risk assessment always stays up to date. Let's look at a couple of these things in more detail. Now, this is a very simple picture of the IT scope. If we look at this, then at the top we have the business organizations, the business processes or capabilities or market products, parts of the business architecture. And we understand which applications are supporting this. And then below that, we understand the applications on what technologies are dependent, and also on what physical devices are they running, and then also maybe at what locations these are running. And this is the IT scope. This is the sort of thing we have as part of our enterprise architecture and IT portfolio management repository. And with this, we can abstract and aggregate up or down this structure. On the one side, if we start at the top and say, okay, we want to understand what is the impact on the business if parts of the business aren't available. For example, a process can't be executed or an organization isn't running. Is that going to impact us in 1 million a day or no loss a day or billions a day? Is it going to give us a reputational loss? Is it going to do other things to us? We can understand that potential, that damage potential at the top. And we can understand from that how critical each process and organization is. And from that, we can then deduce which applications are critical, and from that, further down, which technologies, which devices, and which locations are critical to execution of a particular process. On the other side, if we look at the other direction from the bottom up, then from bottom up, we can understand by risk assessment what the risk is to a particular location, from earthquakes, from sabotage, political risk, or things like that, or particular devices, or which technologies are risky because they're no longer supported. And from that, we can then understand the risk to a business process or a different organization. So we can use our enterprise architecture model to do this sort of assessment. From the automation perspective, I just want to have a quick look at the typical sort of process and why this is important. When we look at risk management, one of the things we do is a risk assessment, and that starts with a risk objective. And that could be Sarbanes-Oxley, it could be GDPR, a data protection law, or another one. But basically what we do is, based on that risk objective, we define which is the IT scope which is impacted, which applications, processes, locations, etc. do we need to assess. And along with that, at the same time, we need to understand what are the potential threats to those applications, processes, and locations, and we do that by making a catalog of possible threats. And then we go through a process of assessing what is the probability of the threat occurring, and if it occurs, what is potential damage. And this results in a calculated risk value. And with this calculated risk value, we can then prioritize and say, okay, we understand now which applications or processes or locations are most at risk. What can we do to mitigate that? Do we need to start a project? Do we need to introduce new controls, etc.? And this sort of process looks simple, but as we know, the combination of these different things that we're assessing and the different threats is actually huge. So any possibility to automate this is going to save us money, and that's the sort of thing we can do in Alphabet, or we could pass on information to the GRC solution to make sure that's done. Last thing I just want to talk about before going into the demo is when we do our IT risk management efforts, one thing we need to be aware of is that the efforts that we're doing at some point are probably going to be audited, maybe even yearly, depending on what sort of organization we are. And here I just want to go through some of the things that auditors might want to look out for, or might point out when they're going doing their audit. And what I'd like to do is use a structure for this that is actually one that is provided by the regulatory office for the financial services industry in Germany, which is actually called BaFin, and they provide a model which is called BITE. And we're going to just quickly look at this model to understand the sort of things that auditors look out for. So let's start here. On one side, they want to know if you have an IT strategy. And they really want to know is not only if you have an IT strategy, but if you got principles and standards and things that you deduce from that strategy, and are they being communicated intern to the organization, to your IT providers, suppliers, outsourcers, so that the strategy you have is also being implemented. They will also look for IT governance to see if you also have controls, if you have reporting, if you have KPIs, if you have processes in place that also ensure that strategy is executed. And they'll want to know what are your IT risk management processes. Are you assessing the IT risk management for applications? Do you profile which ones are the most critical? Do you do a risk analysis? Do you get the business to sign off on any risk acceptance? They'll want to know if you're doing information security management. Do you have guidelines for information security? Are these communicated? Are they being lived out in your organization? And the same sort of thing with user access management. They'll want to know what the guidelines. They'll want to know if you have role-based access. They'll want to know if there's a provisioning process for user rights. is that process safe? Can you prevent administrators giving themselves rights? And then they'll look at things to do with how IT is done. They'll check if IT projects and application development is being done in a way which avoids risk. In particular, things like, do you have versioning for your code? Do you do code reviews? Do you ensure that there's no backdoor code in there that could subvert your operations? And similarly, they want to know if your operations is running in a risk-averse way, including especially things like recovery procedures, archiving, these types of questions. And last but not least, I want to know if you're actually imposing your own risk management efforts onto your providers to ensure that they follow the same sort of procedures. Do you have standardized contracts and SLAs to ensure that this is done? These sort of questions. And this is the structure I'd like to use in the demo, just to point out a couple of areas, not all 8 of these because that would take too long, just a couple of areas to see how we support them from an EA and IT portfolio management perspective. So with that, I'll go over to the demo part of the portfolio playbook. And to do that, I'm going to go over to the browser. And here we are in Alphabet. This is a HTML5 interface for the application. And it's been tested on all major browsers. And we're logged in here as a user called John Customer. He could change his language. He also has different profiles. He has a many here. That is not typical. This is just because it's a demonstration user. Typically, you'd have one role. But this role will actually define the UI that you get. And it will be one that's actually configured to best match the job you have in the organization. Here we are in the interface, and what we have here is a dashboard. And a dashboard is actually something a user can create, an end user, basically to mix graphics and bookmarks to create a visual image with which you can tell a story. And he could do this to support a presentation, or he could do this just to make his work from day to day easier by bringing his favorite bookmarks into such a dashboard. So what I want to do is point out 3 areas that we support with EA and IT portfolio management. And I'd like to start off with the area of the strategy and principles. And here we actually have a principle that's been defined. And this is a principle is actually to do with information architecture and also with information security, data protection. Basically, it's a principle for the financial industry. This is a bank we're looking at, and they're saying customer data must be persistent in the country of ownership, of business ownership. So we've got the principle. It's got here on the right-hand side a justification, an implication, and a description. But what we want to know is this principle being communicated? Is it being lived out in the organization? And here we see a couple of things that point out that this is the case. One, we see it has a version, it has a status. So obviously this principle is being reviewed regularly and it's being approved. The actual approval, if we just scroll down quickly, we can see here in a workflow. And this workflow actually went through 2 boards. One was the architecture board, one was the compliance board. And that's because it's an architecture and the security principle that affects compliance. And this is the sort of typical workflow that we support with a workflow engine, which is an integrated part of Alphabet. But we also see a valid to and a valid from, or a valid from and a valid to in the right order. And this tells us the life cycle. And basically, the valid to here would be used to trigger a review workflow maybe 12 months ahead of this valid to date. And we have monitors in the product that would automatically trigger a workflow saying, okay, we want to review the principle. We want to see how it's working. Do we need to change it? Do we need to change the life cycle? And this is the part of the management of the principles that we're communicating, and that are part of the implementation of our IT risk management activities. I'd just like to go into edit quickly, just to point out one more thing. And this is here, we have the ability here to say to what areas of my enterprise architecture does it apply. And here we've got 3. One, does it apply to a business capability? And we've chosen here that it does apply to some. For example, here, contact management and direct marketing management, which is not surprising because we're talking about customer data. And we also get the ability here to say which data elements does it apply to. And here we have things like account movement. We could also say which technologies, but this is not that sort of principle, so we haven't chosen any. And the advantage of doing this is that then we have this sort of principal impact report. And this tells us, based on the business capability which is impacted, which applications support that business capability, and these are the ones that we have to ensure that the principle is being implemented in. So what we could do is use this data then to send out a control using a workflow and a survey to say, okay, have you implemented this principle for this application? When not, when do you intend to do it? And this sort of thing could be done every year to ensure that you're communicating and implementing your principles. And this is the sort of thing that auditors would look out for. With that, I'd like to go back to the dashboard and look at the second area. The second area here is about information risk management and understanding the risks to the different parts of our enterprise architecture and to our IT architecture. And what we're doing here is looking at inventory of applications. This inventory of applications is actually alphabetical. So here we see all the ones starting with S and T. In the previous portfolio playbooks, we've actually looked at this inventory from a capability point of view, saying which applications support a particular capability. And what we're doing here is looking at an application called TradeNet. I'll just blend out the Explorer so we see more of it. And with this TradeNet, we see different types of data that's been maintained for the application, the business architecture, technology platform, information architecture, the deployments, etc. And this is very important from a risk management perspective, because here, if we look at TradeNet, we understand TradeNet here is supporting from a business perspective mergers and acquisitions, asset class trading, hedging, different processes, and also these different organizations. And if we understand the criticality of these processes and organizations, and that's an assessment we have to do with business, we can then deduce the criticality of this application and say, how much do we need to protect it? How much do we need to put an effort into ensuring this application is secure? How high does our backup and recovery procedure service need to be for this application? These sort of questions. So that's the one side, understanding the criticality from a business perspective. What I'd like to do now is look at the deployments and understand the risk to this application. And what we see here is that this application actually has 3 deployments. One of them is for Berlin, one is for Europe and the Middle East and Africa, and the other one is for the rest of the world. And these 3 deployments, if we look at this report on them, here they're colored 3 different colors. If we want to understand them a bit better, we show the connected items here. We understand that this European deployment is actually an application which is deployed on 4 different physical devices. Yeah, we have a main server, an application server, an identity management server, and a web server. And we understand for each server which different packages of software are running on that server. So that gives us an idea of the deployment. And if we go further down, what we also see is a view of actually where these deployments are physically. So here we see the TradeNet European deployment again. It's colored in yellow. And we actually see that the 4 servers that it's running on are positioned in Moscow in the 4th floor. And if we drew down into 4th floor, then we'll see it's actually in Leibnizstrasse. And we drew down to Leibnizstrasse, we'll see that 4th floor is in Germany, in Berlin. And so we understand here it's in Moscow, it's in Berlin, in Germany, and this one is actually in the US. We understand that this application is actually in a deployment which is physically separated across 3 different locations. What we also see is that these different locations are colored in different colors. And I'll just talk about that in a minute. But we also see at the bottom different numbers here. And we see here for Berlin, they're all 1. Here for Moscow, they're different numbers. The higher ones, the 3 and the 4 are in a circle here. And we'll just take a look at what this means by picking up the legend. And basically what we see here is that there's been a risk assessment for these locations. So we see here that the color here is the more red it is, the higher the risk. So Moscow is considered the most risky location. And this is actually a compound indicator based on these 6 indicators that follow it. We've done a geological risk assessment, an infrastructure risk assessment, a political risk assessment, a staff risk assessment, supplier risk assessment, and weather risk assessment, whether we get tornadoes, that sort of things. And basically, we saw that in Moscow, the 2 circles were the higher numbers, and that was political risk and staff risk. These are considered higher, and so the overall risk score is higher. So what we see here is actually then for our deployment, the yellow deployment, that there's risk to this application because we have this web server in Moscow. So this might tell us that we want to move it. And this is why it's so important to have this IT scope information. I'd just like to drill up here and just take a quick look at the location Moscow. And if we do take a look at the location, then we understand that it's not only the web server there's other physical devices. 2 applications are dependent on that, and we understand the operating entity and the business processes that rely on that. And this is a good way of understanding then, and this is the sort of thing that's used to aggregate the risk indicators to higher levels, say what's the risk to this process because of Moscow. And we can do the opposite if we just drill into the process. We land on the process, and there's a report on the process which is talking about the risk. And here we understand then for the process which locations are hosted IT which run this process. And so we see the different locations that are there and highlighted by the risk assessment. So we see again that the Russian one or Moscow is considered riskier. And also if we just change view here, we understand not only the IT perspective, but also the risk due to the actual people, the departments where they are. We see the departments are in different countries and which ones, again, have which risk profile. So with that, I'd like to go back to our dashboard. And we're going to go slightly over time, but I do want to quickly look at this last topic. And this topic here is actually the one that I talked about in the slide where we actually loaded the threats from the NIST web page. And we can do this automatically using a batch process. And really, when the threats on the NIST page are grouped, and they're grouped actually by vendor, and then by product and by version, and then you come to the actual threat. And these threats can be first assessed, are they relevant for the organization, and when then you can do an assessment of how to mitigate them. And this is basically what we've done here in the product. And here, if I just blend away this Explorer, you see the threats over time, the distribution of threats. Important here, we see which parts of our technology portfolio are affected by these threats. We can understand if they're being phased out anyway, we don't need to consider those threats anymore. And we could also do impact analysis, saying which applications and processes are dependent on there. And here we see a mitigation view which says, okay, these threats, we've assessed them, and we've introduced new controls to mitigate this threat. We could also, this is not the case in this example, have started projects. So we understand, we've done a threat assessment, we've understood which parts of our enterprise architecture impacts, and we've mitigated it. So with that, I'd like to go back to the slideware and move on to just introduce the next portfolio playbook series. We're doing another one. And this one is actually based on best practices for today's IT. We're starting it in September, and it will run through the autumn. And the first one we're going to do is on a very important topic. That's this GDPR topic, the data protection, and how to do that sustainably. And that will be followed by one in October on IT strategy and how to bridge the gap to execution, one in November on managing projects in the digital business age, and one in December on how to make smart cloud deployment choices. And with that, I'd like to just hand over to Paula and ask if she has had any questions.
Yes, there's been some that have come in through the chat. Let's see. We'll just limit it since we don't have a whole lot of time now. Okay, the first one is, you showed an approval workflow for a principal. Is it the same workflow for all types of principals?
It's a good question. I think the question here is that obviously we come out, it can be if you want it to be, but it doesn't have to be. We deliver a sample workflow for this topic, but we realize that when you talk to different organizations, they have different structures and different procedures, and they'll want the workflow to reflect their process. So it will be changed, and typically part of the scoping when we start with the customer would say, how do you want the process? And it's very easy to configure the processes to match the workflows to match the process of your organization. So they can be the same, they can be different. It depends what matches your organization best.
Okay. So you said Alphabet can support risk assessments. How does the product know who to send the assessment to?
That's a good question, actually, because obviously you need, if you don't know, you don't save yourself any effort. Basically, when part of the risk assessment is that we define the IT scope, so we might define the applications that are affected and the processes. And on those objects, we define roles. So on the application, you'd have maybe an application owner, maybe you'd have an IT provider, you might have a developer, and one of those might be an IT security person. And then that role, you'd choose which role it is, would be who would receive the risk assessment survey or the controller survey, that sort of thing. So really, we use this role concept. Just as we had role-based access in the interface, we have roles defined. These roles are used also to define who does what in the context of workflows and of risk assessments and surveys.
Okay,
and the
good.
roles are actually configurable,
right.
so you can configure them to match your organization. Sorry, Paula. I'll hand back to you.
Okay, good. Okay, good. No, all right, well, good. That's, I think, it for today then. David, thanks for a very informative presentation. And with that, our program is ended. Hope to see you all in our fall series. Thank you, and have an enjoyable rest of your day.